The beggar woman came up the carriage drive at Carn, in a mantle worn to the color of wet ash, and the bride, who was to be married within the fortnight, looked down from the morning-room window and laughed. It was the 3rd week of September, the year the harvest came in early along that stretch of the Cornish coast, and the wind off the water carried salt into every room of the house. The woman at the gate did not hurry. She leaned upon a stick of blackthorn and set one foot before the other on the gravel, as though each step were a small and deliberate decision, and the hem of her mantle was heavy with the mud of a long road. From the window the bride saw only rags. She did not see the straight back beneath them, nor the way the woman's gaze traveled across the house front and counted the windows. She did not see that the eyes inside the hood were gray and clear and old and missed nothing at all. Esme saw her first from the dairy. She had her sleeves pushed past the elbow and her arms cold to the bone from the morning's work, and through the low window above the cooling slabs she watched the stranger come and felt, without knowing why, that the day had tilted on its hinge. She set down the skimmer. She wiped her hands on the coarse apron that was the only garment in that house she was permitted to call her own, and she went out into the yard before anyone could tell her to stay. You will want to know how a daughter of that house came to be standing in its dairy, in a servant's apron, while another woman wore her name in the morning room. Stay close. It is the whole of the story, and it begins, as these things so often do, with a death and a lie told over a fresh grave. 2 years before, Esme's father had been the master of Carn, a quiet widower of failing health who had sent his only child away to a school in Bath when she was 14, meaning to spare her the sight of his decline. He had meant it as kindness. It became the door through which the theft walked. For when he died, in the cold spring of the year, the men of the neighborhood who came to bury him had not laid eyes on his daughter in 6 years, and they would not have known her face from any other young woman's in the county. The steward knew this. His name was Jago Pendarvis, and he had kept the books of Carn for 11 years. And in all that time he had watched the estate's income pass through his hands and into another man's coffers, and he had grown to feel that the unfairness of this could be corrected by a clever man with a steady nerve. When the master lay dying, he sent no word to Bath. He let the school turn the girl out for unpaid fees, and he let her find her own way home on the carrier's cart, friendless and unannounced 3 weeks after the funeral, into a house that had already decided she did not exist. By then, the woman in the morning room was installed. Selina Roskilly had been a lady's companion in Falmouth, pretty and watchful and quick, with a gift for wearing other people's manners as though they had been cut for her. Pendarvis had found her and schooled her in the dead man's history, and presented her to the county as the heiress of Carn returned at last from her schooling. The neighbors had no reason to doubt it. She wept becomingly at the graveside. She knew the names of the dead man's horses, and when the true daughter arrived at the kitchen door with the dust of the road on her, thin and exhausted and asking for her father, Pendarvis met her in the passage and told her, in a voice as smooth as poured cream, that the household was full, that the master was a fortnight buried, and that if she persisted in her wild claim he would have her taken up before the magistrate as a vagrant and a thief. She had no letters. The school had kept them against the debt. She had no portrait, no servant who remembered her, no living relation nearer than a great aunt in Bristol who had not written in a decade. She had a child's memory of the house, and a face that no one in the county could vouch for. And she was 18 years old, and alone. And the alternative to the dairy was the road. And the road in that country, for a young woman without a name, was a short road to a bad end. So she had stayed. She had let them call her Marin, which was the name the cook gave her on the first day, and which stuck the way a wet leaf sticks to stone. She had learned to keep the dairy and scald the pans and carry the morning milk, and she had learned the harder lesson too, which was to keep her eyes down and her claim behind her teeth. And to wait for what? She could not have said. Yet she had her father's patience in her, and a thing in her chest that would not lie down and die, and she had decided, on the worst of the nights, that she would not give them the gift of her despair. To the county, she was no one. To the household she was the dairymaid who had come from nowhere with a strange manner and a way of speaking above her station. And Mrs. True, the housekeeper, who had served the True family 30 years and had been pensioned off to a cottage at the lane's end when Pendarvis took control, was the only soul in 3 parishes who had cause to wonder. Such was the house the beggar woman walked into on the 3rd week of September. And the bride at the window, laughing, did not know that she had 3 days left to wear another woman's life. The beggar asked for bread at the kitchen door, and the cook, who had a hard year behind her and a hard winter ahead, told her to be off. It was Esme who stopped her. She had nothing of her own to give. She gave it anyway. She broke her own dinner in half, the brown loaf and the wedge of cheese set by for the dairymaid's noon, and she carried it out to the woman on the mounting block and pressed it into her hands, and she fetched a cup of the morning's milk that she would answer for later. And she stood while the woman ate. The gray eyes studied her over the bread. "You give away your own meal," the woman said. Her voice was not a beggar's voice. Esme noticed it and said nothing. There is no profit in it. The cook would have turned me off and lost nothing. "You were hungry," Esme said simply. "That is the whole of the reason. I have been hungry. It is not a thing I would wish on a dog. And the milk? You will be beaten for the milk. Then I will be beaten for the milk." She said it without heat, without the pride that fishes for praise, and she gathered the empty cup and turned to go back to her pans, and she would have thought no more of it had the woman not spoken once again. "What is your name, child?" There was a moment then, a held breath, in which Esme stood with the cup in her 2 hands, and the wind off the sea pulling at her apron, and the whole long-buried truth of her rose into her throat like water rising in a well. She looked at the old woman in the rags, and she did not know why. She answered as she did. Perhaps because the eyes were kind. Perhaps because after 2 years, she could no longer bear to give the lie one more time. "They call me Marin," she said. "But it is not my name." And she went in and did not see the old woman set down the cup very slowly and look after her a long while and gather the rags closer, about a back that was suddenly very straight. The Dowager Duchess of Penmarrow had not worn rags in 40 years. She had worn them once, as a bride herself, fleeing a fire that took her father's house and half her dowry, walking 11 miles through a January night, in a borrowed cloak, to the only door that would open to her. And she had never forgotten what it taught her. She had learned that night what a person is when nothing is left to them but their own conduct. She had learned to watch a household from below, before she trusted it from above. And she had taught her son nothing so thoroughly as this, that a great name is a coat anyone may steal, but the way a person treats a beggar at the door is a thing that cannot be borrowed or rehearsed. Her son was Ruin, the Duke of Penmarrow, and he was 29, and he was to be married within the fortnight to the heiress of Bryher Cairn, whose lands marched with his own along 4 miles of cliff, and whose union with his house would close a gap that 2 generations of his family had failed to close by any other means. It was a sensible match. His advisers approved it. The settlements were drawn. He had met the lady 3 times, and found her agreeable, accomplished, and entirely correct. And if there was something in her that he could not warm to, some smoothness over which his regard found no purchase, he had set it down to his own coldness of which the county had long complained. His mother had not set it down to anything. She had received the bride at Penmarrow a month before, and watched her across a dinner of 4 removes, and she had come away with a single sentence lodged in her like a splinter. She had asked the young woman, idly over the fish, what her father's favorite of all his horses had been, and the bride had answered without hesitation that it had been the Grey Hunter, Castor, and she had told a charming small story of feeding him apples as a child. It was a good story. It was so good that the dowager, who forgot nothing, had remembered, 3 weeks later, turning it in the dark before sleep, that the late master of Bryher Cairn had been thrown from a Grey Hunter at the age of 30 and had never afterward sat anything but a quiet bay, and had been heard to say at his own table that he would sooner ride the devil than another grey. It might have been nothing, a faulty story, a misremembered childhood, a bride nervous before her husband's terrifying mother. The dowager did not believe it was nothing. And because she had learned long ago that she could trust no eyes in such a matter but her own, and that a household tells the truth to a beggar, that it would never tell to a duchess. She had put on the oldest cloak in the still-room press, and walked the last 4 miles up the coast road, and come to the kitchen door of Briar Carn to see for herself who lived in that house, and who served, and which of them carried herself like the daughter of the man whose portrait she had seen once long ago in his prime. She had found her answer in the yard, in a dairymaid who broke her own bread for a stranger, and would be beaten for a cup of milk, and gave a name that was not her name. What the dowager did then, she did. Slowly, for she was old, and the thing she suspected was monstrous, and she would not act upon a feeling. She took a room at the inn in the village, under the name of a widow traveling to her sister, and she spent 2 days in the rags, walking the parish, asking her small harmless questions at the well, and the church porch and the smithy. She learned that the heiress had come home from school after the funeral, and that no one had seen her arrive. She learned that the old housekeeper, Mrs. Traywin, had been turned out the very week the new mistress was installed, which was a curious economy in a house that had just lost its master. And on the evening of the 2nd day, she walked to the cottage at the lane's end and knocked, and a stout grey woman opened the door, and the dowager put back her hood and said, "Mrs. Trevin, I am the mother of the man your young mistress is to marry. I think you and I have been waiting, each in our own way, for someone to ask the right question. Will you let me in, Mrs. Avera?" Said wept then the slow, hard weeping of a woman who has carried a thing alone too long. She had served the family 30 years. She had held the true Esme as a baby and bound her grazed knees and packed her trunk for Bath, and she had come back from her sister's in Plymouth a month after the funeral, to find a stranger in the morning room, and the steward's man at the gate, and when she had said one word against it, she had been turned out within the week. She had no proof. Her word was a pensioned servant's word against a steward and a magistrate, and she had been told plainly that if she spoke, she would be had up for slander and lose even her cottage. So she had held her tongue and watered her cabbages and watched the lie put on a wedding gown. There was a mark, she said to the dowager, by her own fire, with her 2 hands wrapped round a cup she did not drink from. The child Esme. A burn, here. She touched the inside of her own left wrist, 3 years old. She pulled a pan of scalding milk from the dairy shelf, and it caught her there, and her father near went mad with the fright of it. It healed to a white scar the size of a thumbnail, and it never faded, for I rubbed it with goose grease every winter of her childhood. The woman in that house has no such mark. I have seen her wrists bare at the table. Yet the dairymaid, the one they call Marin," she stopped. Her cup trembled. "I have seen her draw water with her sleeves up. I have seen the scar. God forgive me, I told myself it was coincidence. I told myself the child was dead, drowned on the road, anything, because to believe the truth was to know what I had let them do." The dowager sat very still. Outside, the wind had risen, and the sea was loud upon the rocks below the cliff, and somewhere in the dark a curlew called its long falling note. "It is not coincidence," she said at last. "And you did not let them do anything. You were one old woman, against a thief, with the law in his pocket. There are 2 of us now. And in 3 days they mean to sign a marriage contract that will carry stolen land into my family, and a stolen name into my son's bed, and I find I am not willing to permit it. She had 3 days. She would need every hour." The next morning the dowager of Penmorrow returned to the great house, not in rags, but in grey silk and her own diamonds, and was announced, and the false bride came down to receive her with every grace that 2 years of careful study could supply. Selina had not the smallest suspicion that the beggar she had laughed at from the window, and the duchess she now curtsied to, were the same woman. Why should she? The poor are invisible. That is the whole of their use to people like Selina, and the whole of their danger. The dowager had not come to expose her yet, however. She had come to bait a trap, and she baited it gently, with the patience of an old woman who has all the time in the world and means to use every minute of it against you. Over the morning's chocolate, she spoke of the wedding. She spoke of how glad she was, how the families would be joined, how she hoped only that the bride would not find Penmorrow too quiet after the gaieties of her schooling. And then, as if it had only that moment occurred to her, she said that she had brought a small gift, a thing she gave to every bride who married into the house, and she would have it sent up. It came that afternoon, carried by the Duke's own man. It was a writing case of inlaid rosewood, and within it, beneath the standish and the seals, the dowager had caused to be placed a single object and a single request. The object was a miniature in a worn gold frame, a painting of a man in the dress of 20 years before, dark-haired, grave, with a particular set to his mouth. The request, in the dowager's own hand, was this: that the bride, knowing her father's face better than any living soul, should choose from among the 3 miniatures enclosed the true likeness of the late master of Briar Carn, that the dowager might have a good copy made to hang at Penmorrow beside the portrait of her own late husband, so that the joined families should look down together upon the children to come. There were 3 miniatures in the case. None of them was her father. The dowager had taken great pains over this. She had sent to Falmouth and to Truro, and had bought 3 portraits of 3 dead gentlemen of the right age and era, none of whom had ever set foot in Briar Carn, and she had framed them alike, and she had set them before a woman who had never in her life seen the face of the man she called father. It was a cruel little test, and the dowager did not enjoy its cruelty. But she had buried a husband and raised a son alone in a hard world, and she knew that a lie of this size would not be undone by anything gentle. She wanted the false bride's own hand to point at a stranger and call him father before witnesses. She wanted it in writing. What she had not foreseen, what no one could have foreseen, was that Selina Roskelly was cleverer and more frightened than the dowager had judged, and that fear makes its own cunning. The bride opened the case alone. She looked at the 3 faces and understood in one cold plunge of the heart that she could not tell which to choose, and that to choose wrong was to hang herself, and that the old woman had not asked an idle thing. And then she did what the desperate clever always do. She did not guess. She found someone who knew, and she made them serve her. She sent for the dairymaid. It was given out that the kitchen wanted scolding, and the dairy accounts wanted checking, and Marin was brought up the back stair to the morning room, and the door was shut, and Selina turned upon her with the 3 miniatures laid out on the table, and her face stripped of all its borrowed grace. "You," she said, "you came from his school. You have the manner of it, however you came by it. You will look at these and tell me which is the late master of this house, and you will do it quickly. And you will say nothing of it to any living soul, or I will see you taken up for the silver that has gone missing from the pantry, every piece of which I have hidden in your bedstraw with my own hands. Choose, which is he?" And Esme, standing in her servant's apron, in the room that should have been hers, looked down at the 3 painted faces of strangers, and understood, slowly, then, all at once, what the old beggar woman had set in motion. She understood that this was a test, and that the woman before her did not know her own father's face, and that the thief had just confessed the whole of the theft into the only ears in the county that already knew it to be a lie. She understood that her hour, the hour she had waited 2 years for, without daring to name it, had come up the back stair and stood before her in a stolen gown. She might have pointed at any face. She might have sent the false bride to ruin with a lie of her own. She did not. She had decided, on the worst of the nights, what kind of woman she would be when the chance came, and she found that the decision held. She looked at the 3 strangers, and she told the truth. "None of these is the master of Briar Carn," she said, and her voice did not shake. "My father was darker than any of the 3, and his hair held no curl, and he wore no ring upon his right hand as the middle one does, for he had given his wedding ring to be melted with my mother's when she died, and carried the gold in a locket against his heart until the day he followed her. You will find no likeness of him here, because the woman who sent these knew that you could not tell him from a stranger. And neither, madam, until this morning, did I think anyone in this county remembered that I could. The room was very quiet. The sea was loud below it. "Your father," Selina said. The word came out of her thin and strange. "You said your father." "I have said it once in 2 years," Esme answered. "To a beggar woman at the kitchen door 3 days ago. I think you had better sit down." Selina did not sit down. Selina was not a woman to faint in a crisis. She had not come so far by fainting. She gathered herself in the space of 3 breaths, and the fear in her hardened into something colder and more dangerous, and she swept the 3 miniatures into the writing case and shut the lid. "No one will believe you," she said. A dairymaid with a wild story, and a scar she might have got anywhere. I have 2 years of this county knowing me as the heiress of this house. I have the steward, and the steward has the magistrate, and I have a duke who has signed the settlements. You have an apron and a grievance. If you breathe one word of this before the wedding, I will have you transported, and do not think for one moment that I cannot." She crossed to the door and set her hand upon it and looked back, and for an instant the mask was wholly down, and the woman beneath it was visible, frightened and ferocious, and very far out over deep water. "I have nowhere to go back to," she said almost to herself. "Do you understand me? Neither of us was given anything. I simply reached out my hand and took what no one was using. You may hate me for it, but do not pretend you would not have done the same, had you the nerve." "I had the chance," Esme said quietly. "Just now, 3 faces and your whole life in my hand. I told the truth. That is the difference between us, and it is the only difference that was ever going to matter. And here is the thing that the false bride did not know, and that the dairymaid did not yet know either, though the wind off the sea was even then carrying it up the cliff toward them. The Dowager of Penmarrow had not gone home. She had asked that morning to be shown the dairy and the cheese room and the famous Bryher Carn herd, for she said she took an interest in such things, and she had been left there by a flustered footman with instructions to wait for the steward. And she had not waited. She had come up the back stair behind the dairymaid, soft as snowfall on an old woman's feet, and she had stood the whole while in the little dark passage with her ear an inch from the morning-room door, and she had heard every word. She had heard the threat of the hidden silver. She had heard the command to lie. She had heard a servant girl with nothing in the world refuse to buy her own freedom with a falsehood, and she had heard a thief confess. She did not fling open the door. She was not a woman for scenes. Her son had it from her. She went back down the stair as quietly as she had come, and she sent her man galloping the 4 miles to Penmarrow with a folded note, and the note said only this: "Come tonight. Bring the box of your father's letters and the lawyer Tregony, and say nothing to anyone. I have found something at Bryher Carn that I would not have you marry. Now you may think you know how a story of this kind must end, with the wronged girl restored and the wicked one cast down, and you would not be wrong about the shape of it. The shape, though, was the easy part. Say, the doing of it was another thing, for the thief was clever and cornered, and had 3 days to make herself unmovable. And she did not spend them weeping." Selina went straight to Jago. "Pendarvis," she told him, white to the lips, "that the dairymaid knew, that the dairymaid claimed the name, that some old woman had been asking questions in the village. And the steward, who had 11 years of stolen rents to lose and a noose at the end of every wrong answer, did not panic either. He had foreseen in the cold, clever back of his mind that this day might come, and he had prepared for it. He had a letter, 2 years old, in the dead master's own hand, or near enough, in which the master disowned his daughter for a runaway match and declared he would know her no more. The steward had forged it patiently from a dozen genuine letters and aged the paper over a candle, and he had kept it against exactly this hour. He had a man in Bath who would swear, for a price, that the true Esme had died of a fever before ever leaving the school. And he had the magistrate, Sir Cruz, who held 1/3 of his own fortune in loans the steward had quietly arranged, and who could be relied upon to find the dairymaid's claim frivolous, and the dairymaid herself a vagrant fit for the House of Correction. So, when the Duke of Penmarrow rode through the gates of Bryher Cairn that night, with his mother's note in his glove and his father's box of letters under his arm, and the lawyer Tregony beside him, the trap was not the simple thing his mother had imagined. The thief had laid a counter-trap, and the morning room into which they were shown was arranged like a court, with the forged letter on the table and the steward grave and respectful at the bride's shoulder, and Sir Cruz the magistrate already present, summoned to lend the law's weight to whatever was about to be denied. The Duke came in and stopped just inside the door. He looked first at his mother, who sat by the fire in her grey silk, with her hands folded and her face unreadable, and then at his bride, lovely and composed in candlelight, and then, last, at the dairymaid who had been sent for and made to stand in the corner like a thing on trial. And something in him, some cold instrument that had served his family for 3 generations and never once lied to him, went very still and very attentive. For he had spent his life among people trained to be charming, and he had learned to mistrust the charm and watch the hands, and he saw that his bride's hands were white-knuckled in her lap, while the dairymaid's hung loose and open at her sides. And he saw that the magistrate would not meet his eye. "My mother writes," the Duke said, into the silence, "that she has found something here. She would not have me marry. I am listening." What followed took the better part of 2 hours, and it was not a thing of shouts and accusations, but of papers, passed and questions asked in level voices, for these were people to whom the forms mattered, and the false bride's whole defense was the forms. The steward produced the forged letter, and the Duke studied it in silence and set it down. The magistrate observed with regret that the dairymaid's claim rested on nothing but her own word, and the scar of a common kitchen burn, and that the law could not unseat an established heiress on so slight a thing. Selina sat through all of it with her eyes lowered in becoming distress, and twice she lifted them to the Duke with exactly the right measure of wounded bewilderment, and the dowager watched her son's face and could not for a long and terrible quarter of an hour tell which way he would fall. It was the lawyer Tregony who turned it, but he could only turn it because Esme had first held to the truth, and the dowager had first carried it to him. Tregony had been the late Duke's man, and was now the young Duke's, and he was old and dry, and had spent 40 years smelling forgery on paper, and he asked, very mildly, whether he might examine the disowning letter at the window in better light. He held it to the candle. He turned it. He observed, in the tone of a man remarking on the weather, that the watermark in the paper was that of a Falmouth mill that had not begun to make paper until the year after the date the letter bore, and that the ink, while aged with smoke, had not aged with time, for it had not bitten into the fibre as ink of the stated age would have done, and that he would stake his certificate and his name that the document before him had been written within the 12-month and dirtied. To look old, a small thing, a watermark. It was the loose thread, and the steward's face which had held through everything came apart at it like wet paper, and the dowager, who had been waiting for exactly that crack, spoke for the first time since the Duke had entered. "I will tell you now," she said, "what I have not yet told my son. 3 days ago I came to this house in rags and asked for bread at the kitchen door, and the cook turned me off, and this young woman in the corner broke her own dinner in half, and gave it to me, and gave me milk she knew she would be beaten for, and when I asked her name she told me it was Marin, but that Marin was not her name. And this morning I stood in the passage outside this very door, and heard your bride, sir, command that same young woman to look at 3 painted strangers, and name one of them her father, on pain of being transported for silver your bride had hidden in her bed with her own hands. And I heard the dairymaid refuse. I heard her tell the truth when a lie would have bought her everything she has been robbed of. I have looked for that quality in a great many drawing rooms, and found it oftener at a kitchen door. There is your heiress, sir. The other is a stranger I would not trust. To mind a goose." The room had gone utterly still. The magistrate, Sir Cruz, had risen halfway from his chair, and now sat slowly down again. For a debt to a steward is one thing, and to perjure oneself before a duke, and a duke's lawyer with a forgery already named is quite another, and he was a coward but not a fool, and he chose, in that instant, his own neck over his creditor's. He said in a voice gone suddenly thin that he had been told the matter was settled, that he had had no notion of any forgery, that of course the documents must be examined, and the Bath witness produced, and the scar attested by a surgeon, and that he washed his hands of any irregularity. It was the sound of a rat leaving. Everyone in the room heard it for what it was. And Selina, watching her steward unravel and her magistrate desert and her 2 years of careful work come down around her in the space of 10 minutes, did the only thing left to a woman who has wagered everything and lost. She stopped pretending. She rose from her chair, and the becoming distress fell from her face like a dropped fan. And what was underneath was not a monster, but only a frightened woman of 27, who had been born with nothing and clawed at the one rich thing that had ever lain unguarded within her reach. She looked at the Duke, and she said with a terrible flat honesty, "I would have been a good duchess. Better than she will be. I have worked for 2 years at being your equal, and she has done nothing but milk cows. You are throwing away the better wife for the truer one, and you will tell yourself it was virtue." It was the Duke who answered, and he answered as his mother had raised him to answer, which was briefly and without cruelty, and with the whole weight of the thing behind the few words. He had crossed the room while she spoke, slowly, and he stood now not before the false bride, but before the dairymaid in the corner. And he looked down into Esme's face for a long moment. The first time in his life he had truly looked at her, and the cold instrument in him that never lied. He turned his head. "I will take the truer one," he said. That was all. He did not match the false bride's cruelty with cruelty. He did not have her dragged out. He turned back to Esme, and into the silence the description of which the dowager would carry to the end of her days, he did a thing that no one in that room had expected, least of all the woman it was done to. He took off his glove. He reached out and he turned her left wrist gently to the candlelight, not to expose her but to honor her, and he looked at the small white scar the size of a thumbnail that her father had near gone mad over 25 years before, and he bowed his head over it as a man bows over a relic, and he said low, so that only she and his mother and the truth could hear it, "Esme, you are home." It was the first time her own name had been spoken aloud in that house in 2 years. She had thought she had forgotten how it sounded. She found that she had not. She found to her own great surprise that she was weeping, she who had not given them the gift of her tears on any of the bad nights, and that the Duke had not let go of her hand, and that the old woman by the fire, the beggar of 3 days before, was looking at the two of them with an expression that the firelight made almost young. The unmaking of the lie took longer than the making of it, for the law is slow when it is being honest. And the false heiress had 2 years of false acts to be quietly undone, the rents repaid, the documents revoked, the neighbors informed without scandal where scandal could be. The steward Jago Pendarvis did not wait to be taken. He was gone before dawn over the cliff path toward the coast, with what he could carry, and the county heard later that a man answering his description had taken ship from Falmouth for the Indies, and the dowager who might have hunted him let him go. "A noose teaches nothing," she said. "Let him spend the rest of his life being a smaller man in a hotter country. That is punishment enough, and I have a wedding to see to." For there was still to be a wedding, though not the one the settlements had named. Selina Roskilly was not transported, and was not ruined past saving, for it was Esme herself who would not have it. She asked one thing, in the cold grey light of the morning, after, when the household stood turned upside down and the false bride waited white-faced in the morning room to learn her fate. Esme asked that the woman be given the price of a passage to a city where no one knew her, and a character that said only that she had been a companion and was honest in service, which was a kinder lie than any Selina had told, and a hard one for Esme to give, and she gave it. "She is right that no one gave her anything," Esme said to the Duke, who had argued for the law. "I cannot give her my forgiveness. That is not yet in me to give. I can give her the thing she stole, however, which is a chance." "Then we are quit," and I owe her nothing. Not even my anger. And the Duke, who had been raised by a woman who walked 11 miles in borrowed rags and never forgot it, looked at the woman he was now to marry and understood that he had got, by the strangest road, immeasurably the better of the bargain. They were married in the small church above the cliff, at the very end of October, with the bare trees black against a sky, the color of pewter, and the sea booming far below, and Mrs. Bunn Trian in the front pew weeping into a handkerchief she had embroidered for the true Esme's christening, and kept these 25 years. The dowager gave the bride away, there being no one else, and she did it in the same gray silk she had worn to spring the trap. And she said afterward that she had given away 2 brides in her life, and only minded losing the first one. What became of the day-to-day of it? The long quiet after the storm was a smaller and steadier thing than the night that had made it, for the storm is the easy part, and the after is the whole of a life. It was this. Esme became the Duchess of Penmarrow, and the lands of Briar Carn were joined to her husband's at last, not by theft, but by marriage, exactly as 2 generations had wished, and none had managed honestly. Mrs. Blank's Trowan was brought back from her cottage to keep the still room at Penmarrow, where she lived to be very old, and to scold 3 small children for pulling pans from dairy shelves. And the dowager, who had walked into the story in rags, and walked out of it the most quietly satisfied woman in the county, went home to her own house and her own fire and her own diamonds, and was by all accounts insufferable about the whole affair for the rest of her days, which were many. The last image is not of any of them, though. It is of a thing Esme did the spring after her wedding when the worst was long over, and the house was hers and no one could ever take her name from her again. She walked down to the old dairy at Briar Carn, which stood empty now and would soon be put to other use, and she went in alone, and she stood a while on the cold flags, where she had skimmed the morning milk for 2 years with her claim behind her teeth. On the low shelf above the cooling slabs, there was still a single chipped cup, the dairymaid's cup, that no one had thought to clear away. She took it down. She held it in her 2 hands a moment, the wind off the sea coming in at the low window the way it always had. And then she did not break it, and she did not keep it as a grief to nurse. She washed it clean in the old stone trough, and she set it back on the shelf where it had always stood, and she went out into the light and pulled the dairy door shut behind her, gently the way you close a door, on a room where someone you once were is sleeping, and will not be disturbed again. If this story moved you, stay a moment and think on the one who was kind at the door when there was no profit in it. For she is the one the whole of it turned upon, and her kindness cost her a meal and won her a life. Thank you for staying until the end.